What's up, film fans? We all know that 2020 was a difficult, dreadful year for most of us. But as it was slipping out the back door, it left us with one last kick in the gut. On the 31st of December, it was announced that Joan Micklin Silver, the great independent filmmaker, had passed away. Silver, if you don't know, is not only one of the best, but also one of the most important independent filmmakers in America in the last 50 years. Over the next few videos, I'm going to be looking at 3 Silver films and talking about her impact on American filmmaking, starting with her groundbreaking first film, Hester Street, the subject of this episode of what makes this film great. Hester Street is a 1975 film written and directed by Joan Micklin Silver, based on a 19th century short story about immigration to New York City, written by Abraham Cahan. It stars Carol Kane, Stephen Keats, Doris Roberts, Dory Kavanaugh, and Mel Howard. The fantastic black and white cinematography is by Kenneth Van Sickle, and the film was edited by Catherine Wenning. It's a film about immigration, specifically the immigration of Russian Jews to the Lower East Side in New York City in the late 19th century. For my money, it's one of the best, most authentic, sort of realistic depictions of New York City immigration that's ever been put on American film, including higher profile pictures like, The Godfather Part 2. Part of its authenticity comes from the fact that much of the film's dialogue is in Yiddish, and when the characters speak English, they speak this kind of Yiddish-inflected English. Because of these factors and others, including the fact that Silver was a woman, no studio would take on the script. No studio would finance the making of the film. Silver and her husband, Raphael Silver, who was a real estate developer, decided to finance the film themselves. They raised $350,000, much of it their own money, and shot the film in New York City in 34 days. But once it was completed, they couldn't get it distributed. Silver continually ran up against one hurdle after another. It was in part Raph's frustration with those hurdles that convinced him to come in and help his wife produce her film. Silver often tells a story about one unnamed Hollywood producer who told her, "Filmmaking is hard enough without getting women involved." Seriously. This is what women who wanted to direct films in the 70s were up against. Elaine May is one of the few women who the Hollywood studios trusted to make films. Even during this time of women's liberation and so on, Hollywood remained very much an old boys club. So once the film was finished, they didn't have a way to get it distributed. And Raph, Joan's husband, heard about this filmmaker in California who was distributing his own films, John Cassavetes, and he called him up. Cassavetes was very supportive. He sent 2 of his colleagues out to New York to help them figure out how to distribute the film on their own, which is what they did. And it became a wild success, contrary to the so-called know-it-alls in Hollywood, and kicked off Silver's career, which would continue for the next several decades. Stephen Keats plays Jake. He's an immigrant to New York who's been living there for several years now, and he's a hustler, full of bravado and braggadocio. He works in a tailor shop, working the sewing machine, but he has big dreams. And he's a fantastic screen presence in the early parts of the film. He reminds me a lot of a Justified era Timothy Oliphant, the way he sort of struts on screen, believes he owns every place he goes, believes he owns everyone he talks to. He wants to assimilate. He's trying as hard as he can to assimilate. He dresses how he thinks an American should dress. He refers to himself or his desires often as Yankee. And he's a fantastic screen presence. Jake is enamored with, or maybe in love with, Mamie, who works as a teacher at a dance school where a lot of single people go in this semi-supervised environment to mingle. And Jake is sort of falling in love with Mamie, and she's somewhat open to his charms and his pursuit. And one of the great early scenes in the film that shows us a lot about both Jake and Mamie's character, but also depicts the way in immigrant New York people lived on top of people, on top of people, on top of people, is this scene when Jake and Mamie are trying to find a place to be intimate.
Let's go inside, let me explain.
No, my landlady.
All right. Goodbye.
Jake. Date.
For what? Poor little orphan. When you come over?
7 years. I come all alone from Poland. When I was 16 years old.
You know, you speak English like a regular Yankee.
Thank you.
I would think you was born here. Hey! Over here.
There's a lot of comedy in that sequence, but we also get a hint at the slightly darker side of Jake's pushy nature, which will come out later. And one of the great things about this film is that it doesn't explain anything. There's not a lot of exposition. We do get some details about Jake's and Mamie's and some of the other characters' backgrounds, and they do talk on occasion about their hopes and dreams, but mostly the camera is content to observe these people and observe their actions. So in this early sequence where we see Jake being a little bit uncomfortably pushy, it's not explained to us where that's coming from. And one of the interesting things about Jake as a character is that even if you don't like him, even if parts of this scene are a little bit uncomfortable, he's a fantastic screen presence, especially in the opening minutes of the film. Another great example of the film not explaining anything is this sequence when Jake goes to Mamie to ask her to borrow some money.
Mamie, listen, I gotta talk to you about something special.
Who?
About this money you got saved.
What about?
Well, I got a chance for a big bargain.
On what?
Furniture.
What kind of furniture?
What kind? Stove, table, chair, pots, pans. Mamie, I gotta have my own place. You give?
Hey, you monkey!
Mamie, I'll pay back every penny, I swear.
Oh, don't bother yourself.
You got in your pocket, maybe?
What?
The money.
Oh, you want it right away, huh?
Oh, you betcha.
Come upstairs.
What about your landlady?
Oh. This is a different thing now, ain't it?
Listen. Better you should get, huh?
Anything you say, Jack. You're the boss now.
What works about this sequence is, as I think you can tell, Mamie believes that Jake wants this new apartment for the two of them. But Jake has other things in mind, which the film has hinted at, but hasn't fully explained that. And that is that Jake has a wife and a son, and they're on their way to America from Russia. Jake's wife is Geetle, played wonderfully by Carol Kane. She was nominated for an Academy Award for this performance. And Jake's big problem here is that he wants Geetle's assimilation or even acclimation to be up to speed with him, even though he's already been in America for several years. And if you've moved to a new country before, you know that you go through stages. And the first stage is what we often call culture shock. These people eat differently, they dress differently, they walk differently, they interact differently in social situations. If language is an issue, they speak differently. Even if language isn't an issue on the surface, I'm an American living in Ireland, there are massive differences. And so when you first arrive in a place, like, oh my God, what is this place? And then immigrants will often go through a process of acclimation. And that's the process of just learning the lay of the land. Okay, this is what they do here. This is how they eat. This is how they communicate. That's a very important process. That's the part of the process where your brain is like, I understand this place. And then the next step is often, although not always, assimilation. And that's when the immigrant decides, I'm going to be, in this case, American. I'm going to be Irish. I'm going to be Hungarian. I'm going to be British, whatever it might be. And all of those things take time. And Jake's well on the road, whereas Geetle has just got off the boat. You know, she lived in a small village in Russia, and now she's surrounded by the teeming masses of Lower East Side, New York City immigration. She barely has time to catch her breath when Jake starts berating her for not being American enough. Early after Geetle's arrival, Jake insists on calling their son Joey, Americanizing his name, and then he insists on cutting Joey's hair. And this scene, I think, is shot in such a way that it's almost a stand-in for a kind of abuse.
Look at him. A little Yankee.
Yankee?
Listen to him, Yankee.
Hair, in fact, becomes an important metaphor in the film. In the European Jewish tradition, married women didn't generally expose their own hair, their natural hair, in public, sometimes even to their family members. So they generally wore wigs or, on occasion, headscarves. And to Jake, this is almost offensive that Geetle, again, still just off the boat, would want to continue to wear her wig or a headscarf and not follow the American fashion, even amongst the Jewish women, of letting her natural hair show. And we get this wonderful scene, this wonderfully attentive scene, where Geetle makes the small concession that she'll take off her wig and exchange it for a headscarf.
Geetle. bist schon in Amerika. Doch in Amerika tragt mir nicht kein Scheit.
Ich habe dich.
Da tragt mir nicht kein Tichlach.
Janke, ich will nicht kein mit eigene Haar. Ich bin eine verirrte Frau.
Nun tu ich schon besser an dich.
Isn't that wonderful what the camera does there? That's an important narrative moment as well as formal moment, because at this point in the film, Jake still comes across as the protagonist. Jake is making the decisions. Jake is domineering Geetle, so much so that at first, all we as viewers can assess about her is that she's timid and she's going through culture shock, and we don't get to see much more of her personality. But Carol Kane plays this with such a quiet and barely discernible assertive dignity that we almost don't notice that there's a protagonist shift going on. And that camera move as she exchanges her wig for the headscarf is like a formal concession to that. The camera seems to be deciding to acknowledge Geetle's wishes not to show her hair in public. And it's a fantastic formal moment that reinforces the film's narrative. Because what this film is going to do very deftly is exchange protagonists. Geetle slowly emerges as the film's main character, while Jake kind of descends into this almost pathetic antagonist position. Jake wants to have the family. He talks on occasion about how a man should have a wife. This is very traditionalist. A man should have a wife at home who keeps the house clean, who raises the children well, and so on. And he brags about that to his friends. But in his mind, he's unsatisfied because he still wants Mamie. He's still in love with Mamie. And he can't make a decision for much of the middle part of the film. And so he becomes a kind of pathetic character. His earlier sort of fire turns at times morose and at times, again, almost abusive, where he yells and hollers and dominates their small apartment to such an extent that Geetle lives in fear of him. Jake and Geetle have a boarder living with them, Bernstein. And Bernstein in the old country was a scholar, a Talmudic scholar. And to Geetle, this is very impressive because the implication is made that not everyone in the film know how to read and write. So a scholar is somebody who is to be looked up to. But we've seen throughout the film that none of the sort of brash, new, assimilated immigrants care about the scholars. What they care about is making money. So for much of the film, Bernstein's kind of sits in the background, observing the family, not necessarily judging them, but kind of removed from them, except that he slowly starts to take on Joey's education. And he becomes a key figure later because Geetle starts to look at Bernstein and see that there's a different kind of man, and there could be a different kind of man in her life. And the thing about Geetle that's interesting and important for the film is she doesn't necessarily resist the idea of acclimation or even assimilation. What she's resisting is Jake's insistence that she do it now, and she do it at his speed, and that she do it to meet his needs. In fact, in one scene, when she finally comes out with her own hair down, Jake has become so caught up in his own mental barriers between what he thinks he wants, this family, and what he thinks he wants for Geetle, modernization, and what he really wants, Mamie, that he becomes enraged when he sees Geetle with her real hair on display. Much of the film's final third has to do with the fallout from first Jake's indecisiveness and then his decision about whether he should stay with Geitel or continue to pursue Mamie. And as those events occur, Geitel continues to take on more of a protagonist role, and the film becomes more interested in what she's going to do and how she and Joey and their boarder, Bernstein, are going to survive this situation. And it's something that, you know, if you take a screenwriting 101, they'll tell you never switch protagonists in the middle of the film. Not because films don't do it, but because it's incredibly difficult. And Hester Street does this so delicately that you're watching a film about this brash man and you're like, oh, this is great, this sort of positive immigrant story. And slowly you're watching a film about this resilient, perseverant woman who's learning how to take care of herself. And it's a fascinating portrayal by Kane, and it's a fascinating portrayal by Keats too. Like I said, even though he becomes more and more repugnant, his screen presence continues to be, you know, highly watchable throughout. Other parts of the film that are highly watchable are the street scenes, and Silver's made this decision to shoot a lot of the outdoor scenes almost like a silent film, so we get scenes of people moving through the streets with background music and no dialogue. And then it's also full of these wonderful little touches of what life on the streets of Lower Manhattan must have been like. Like this scene where we get some of the silent movie effects when Jake is approached by a hat salesman on the street. Hester Street is a wonderful, wonderfully made film, made with such care, and it's amazing that they shot this in 34 days. And it's amazing to me today, looking at it, with all of the sort of throwback films that were coming out in the early 70s, that studios didn't see the potential for this film. And you have to realize that the blinders on them probably wasn't the content, probably wasn't the themes. It was the fact that it was written by a woman who wanted to direct it. And it's indicative of how short-sighted Hollywood has been throughout its history, because this is an amazing film that is a really understated marriage of excellent writing, directing, and performance that all come together to tell a simple story with really great depth, thought-provoking depth. And it's the kind of film that you can watch over and over for different elements of it and find new things every time. That's all for now, everybody. I'll be back again with another Joan Micklin Silver film in the next episode of What Makes This Film Great. Until then, my name's Aaron Hunter. Keep watching movies.